Thank you, Pete. Now, I haven't forgotten communion this today. We're putting communion after the sermon, and then following that, you have the opportunity to be prayed for as well. I invite you to take advantage of that if that is something you'd like to do. Good morning, everyone. If I haven't met you, my name is James. I'm the minister here, and we're really glad that you could join us today, whether it be online or here in person. You're all looking lovely. Why did you laugh? So a reminder during that last song, He Will Hold Me Fast, I think it was Martin Luther, when he felt he was being tempted, would say back, I have been baptized. It's this sense that the grace of God and the power of God is even greater than how we're feeling at the moment, greater than how you're feeling right now or what you're thinking right now, that because he'd been baptized, he'd been held by God. God had him in the palm of his hand, and no matter what, he would hold him. I have been baptized. What a lovely song and a lovely image is that of God just holding us no matter how we're feeling or how things are going. I hope you've had a sense of that this morning and you'll continue to do so. We are concluding this morning a series on the book of Job. And so before I start part 4, I invite you to pray with me. Our Lord and God, we come before you now, before this reading, before your word, perhaps eager, perhaps confused, unsure. We ask that you would open it up to us, that it would illuminate our hearts and our minds and our souls, that it would transform us. In your word we pray. Amen. I'm of the opinion that the conclusion to Job is only really satisfying in light of Jesus. There's a lot of people who don't find it satisfying. And the main reason for that is it just seems quite unrealistic. He was Job, a man who suffered innocently. If you've been around the last few weeks, you know what happened to him. In one day, all of his property gone, his livestock and his servants either murdered and destroyed or carried off by raiders. All of his 10 children die in a day, and then as if he needed anything more on his plate, he develops a debilitating skin disease. Over the next few days and weeks, he wrestles with his friends that came to comfort him and didn't do such a good job. And he wrestles with God, crying out, this is unfair, this is not right, this is not just. If only I could defend myself, I will show that I didn't deserve this, that you've done the wrong thing, God. And then here in the end, it can feel a little bit like an anti-climax, or maybe just plain unrealistic. Job's fortunes are restored. His property is rebuilt. For every cow he lost, he gains 2 back. Or the servants restored to him, 10 more children to him, and effectively he lives happily ever after. It feels maybe a little bit unrealistic to us, to those of us who suffer innocently, to those of us who suffer with chronic pain throughout our life and for whom there is no restoration at the end, die with that chronic pain. For people who suffer the grief of loss of a broken down relationship or losing someone they love, and who not only don't get them back, but just can't seem to get out of that spiral of grief. You know, sometimes in our situation, the ending Job had seems far from inevitable. The opposite almost seems inevitable, that this life might just end in suffering and misery. That's from our perspective. It's a bit different if we look at it from the perspective of Jesus. See, at first, as we see Jesus hanging on the cross, it might even look like it confirms our worst suspicions. Here is someone who was perfectly righteous and faithful and kind, and yet even he didn't get justice. Here he is dying. Here is someone, the Son of God, the perfect human, and yet he seems overcome with grief and despair and pain. Here is God of God, the Son of God himself, and it seems like death is all-powerful over him, that death will have the last word even for him. Yeah, when we see Jesus on the cross, it maybe confirms our worst suspicions. But then 3 days later, God turns everything upside down. Or perhaps we should say he turns it the right way up. He raises Jesus from the dead, and in doing so, declares loud and clear, once and for all, without qualification or any sort of caveat at all, that he is greater than death. That death is not the end of our story, that life is, that this life doesn't end in suffering and pain, but with joy. See, I think we miss as Christians just how radical it is to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. When we believe that, it's not just an intellectual act believing something happened at a point in history. It's not even just believing that this thing happened that confirmed that Jesus really is the Son of God. Believing that Jesus rose from the dead changes the way you see reality altogether. How does the saying go? There's two things you can rely on in life. They are death and taxes. Well, because Jesus rose from the dead, we know that they're not the only things you can rely on. There are things that are even more reliable, things that are even more inevitable, and that is life and joy. Because Jesus rose from the dead, we know that suffering and meaninglessness are not foundational to the earth. We know that it's not anger and greed and lust that are all powerful and make people do things despite what our advertisers believe. It's beauty and hope and joy. Because Jesus rose from the dead, we know that God is able to work justice in the end, that not even death can stop his justice, that we will all experience what Job experienced, at the risk of making it sound trite, happily ever after. That in the end, when God restores all things, we'll all know eternal joy in his presence. Now, the conclusion of the book of Job isn't there as a sort of justification for his suffering or for ours. It's not as if it's there going, hey, look, see, you're going to get more in the end, stop your complaining. It's not a way of saying that God really was in charge and willing every small thing that happened in life, that everything really was just because Job ends up getting more in the end. No, that would go counter to the entire message of the rest of the book. The conclusion to the book of Job is saying, look, see, this suffering that he went through really was unfair. It really was unnecessary. It really was unjust. Despite what his family think, it really wasn't from God at all. Instead, God was fighting against it. And he will be victorious over it. In light of the resurrection, we know for sure it is guaranteed. In the end, there will be justice and peace and love and hope. And it's important for us to believe that and to see it. Again, if you've been here the last few weeks, you'll know that the book of Job is a book of wisdom. It's not primarily interested in theology. That's not its number one interest, answering the question, why do good people suffer? Instead, it's more interested in practical living. How do we suffer? How is it that the wise, the righteous, persevere through suffering, endure it, are good in the midst of it? And right now, what this conclusion to the book of Job is telling us in light of the resurrection of Jesus is that to endure suffering well, we hope. Christian hope is as simple and as difficult as this. It's just keeping our eyes, keeping in our mind the sure fact that in the end, God will restore all things. Some days we might believe that with great passion, bounding with faith, absolutely 100% sure with no doubt in us whatsoever that God will restore all things. Some days it might be a more feeble declaration, a mustard seed of hope, just knowing, just clinging to it that God will do it and make it happen. See, the Christian hope, it's not a naive optimism. It's often what we get it confused with. A naive optimism says if I do A, B, and C, then things will get better in this life. A Christian hope instead says things might get worse. I might not be able to do anything about them, but I know that God will be with me in the midst of them and he will restore all things in the end. A naive optimism says that this time the doctor will have a cure for sure. This time I'll be reconciled with that person. This time, if I only do this, I know I'll definitely get that job. Hope says that even if the doctor doesn't have the answer, even if you don't get the job, even if there is no reconciliation, God is with you and he will restore all things in the end. I don't know about you, but I used to think that hope was just something we did to make ourselves feel better, kind of like a mindfulness type thing, a little almost psychological trick that we do just to get through suffering. But then I noticed something really funny about where hope sits within the New Testament. You often find hope among what we call virtue lists. These are lists in the New Testament that describe the things that we do that are good, how to be good. If you want to be good, love. It's the right thing to be self-controlled. It is good to be faithful. A righteous person is generous and kind, and then they hope. See, hope isn't just this little mindfulness trick. It's actually something we are commanded to do. It is a good thing to do, to keep our eyes and our focus on the fact that God will work justice in the end. See, when we suffer, it's like suffering is this almost blanket upon us, this darkness enveloping us. And as much as the suffering itself hurts, one of the even more painful things is this nefarious little whisper it has in our ear saying there is no meaning, you're not going to win, there is no justice, nothing is good. Everything is just pain and meaningless chaos. It's whispering at us as we face our own suffering. To hope is to take a stand against evil. To say to it, you've taken this away from me, you've given me this pain, I won't let you take away my hope, my trust, my faith in goodness. It's to take a stand in the midst of it, to gain your own agency back, to be who you are. See, hope cultivates virtue. It makes us better people. Despair, the opposite, takes it away. I think we all know people who manage to cling, whether in a big way or a small way, to hope in the midst of their pain. I think of someone that I used to work for actually. She was born with a degenerative eye condition. And seeing doctors over time, it became clear that there was nothing that they were going to be able to do about it. It was just going to get worse and worse throughout all of her life until she was basically blind. And it would have been easy to give in to that voice saying, see, there is no meaning, there is no purpose. But instead she clung to hope, to the hope that God would be with her in the midst of the pain and would be victorious over evil in the end. And so she studied education, became a teacher and wanted to do something with her teaching, moved over to the Middle East to do it. And then while she was teaching in Iraq and Saudi, was forced to move out of there because of unrest. And once again, it would have been easy to be despaired. Oh God, I did this for you and it didn't work out. Why did you lead me here? But instead, she chose to hope. She hoped that God would be with her in the midst of it and would restore all things in the end. And I know you all know people like this. To be around her was a joy. She wasn't naive. She didn't pretend that everything was okay. She wasn't happy-clappy in that way. But the depth of her hope, there was something radiant, something beautiful about it that you were just drawn to. The call to hope in the midst of our suffering isn't just to make ourselves feel better. It's a command. It's a virtue. It's a way of saying to evil, as much as you've taken from me, you won't take anything else. You are not all powerful. I know God will be victorious in the end. We're pretty close to the end now. There's just one more lesson the book of Job has for us in terms of how to suffer. The last one is this: as much as we look to the future, God's victory in the future, in the midst of our suffering, we look to his victories in the present, in the ways that he is bringing good out of suffering. You might be aware, the book of Job begins with the accuser coming before God and accusing Job, saying he's not really righteous. Yes, he does the right thing now. He offers his sacrifices and his prayers and he's generous, but that's only because you bless him with all these riches. Take these riches away, take this comfort away, and he'll turn from you in half a heartbeat. Well, at this end of the book, we know that Job has been vindicated. He had all that health, all those riches, all that stuff taken away, and yet he remained righteous. More than that, in the midst of his suffering, he's actually been drawn closer to God. He says, as we heard in our reading, God, I just had heard of you before. I just heard about your wisdom and your power, but now I have seen your face. Now I have seen them. I have experienced them on a deeper level. See, the classic analogy, metaphor used in this type of thing of God is a judo wrestler. Anyone here do judo? Great, because I've got no clue and I can use this incorrectly. I've heard, I think it is true, that one of the main things you do in judo is you use the momentum of your opponent against them. They lunge at you, you let them keep going, and you use it to their disadvantage. And this is what God does to suffering. He didn't send it, he didn't cause it. But as this suffering came at Job, trying to make him to sin, trying to make him to be selfish and trying ripping apart from God, God takes that suffering, that momentum from it, and turns it on its head and uses it as an occasion to show everyone how good Job is, to reinforce his goodness and to draw him closer to himself. We reaffirm at this point, it's important to reaffirm that the New Testament Christian theology declares very clearly that God does not send suffering, that in and of itself, suffering has no meaning, no purpose, no great place in the grand scheme of things. And yet we also know that God is able to bring nothing out of something. It's how he created. So he can bring purpose where there was no purpose. He can bring goodness out of the thing that has no goodness. That as we read in the New Testament, he can work all things to the good of those who love him. It takes spiritual discernment at this point. This is a point where kind of psychology actually lines up with Christian theology and ethics. Apparently it's true, I found out in the research, that they say one of the things that helps you get out of grief in the midst of suffering is being able to find a purpose in the midst of it, to find something good that is coming out of it. And we would affirm that too, that is what we are called to do, to partner with God, to see something come out of nothing, to see purpose come out of it. But it takes spiritual discernment. If you've just faced a loss of a loved one or a loss of a child, I doubt at that point in time, right then and there, God is calling you to find a purpose in the middle of that. I think he's probably calling you to grieve, to mourn, to maybe pray to him brutally, honestly, to tell him how you feel. But as times go on, or for others, if we find ourselves stuck in a cycle of grief, maybe even a little content in our despair, a little content in being unhappy. We're all like that at times. I'm really quite happy being stroppy at the moment. We've all been there. Maybe it takes spiritual discernment to hear God saying, now's the time to see what I'm doing in the midst of this. I didn't send it to you, but now's the time to look and see how it's used for good. I know many of you, if not all of you, will have stories about this. I've heard many of your stories. I think of this man I met, I'll call him John, who went through a really tough time in his life. Marriage breakdown, lost his job, suffered some mental health issues. Just a real time of suffering and pain. He had nothing left to do, nowhere else to go. So in the midst of that suffering and pain, it led him just to be still, to pray, to find a room at the back of his father's property and to sit there and to pray. And for the longest time, he didn't feel God at all, which led him, oddly enough, to pray even more. Eventually, things started to line up. He started to feel God again, and his experience led him to put on retreats for others to be a part of as well. At one of these retreats, I was talking to him, and he said, "It was awful. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. But the way I've grown, how I've grown closer to God in the midst of it, how it's gone on to help others through these retreats, I can't really say that I wish it never happened either. Such is the good that God brought out of it." I think of an elderly lady that I was really close to at a church that I was a part of in the past. I heard that a really active part of the church, a beautiful, beautiful person. And I heard that her health was failing and she struggled to leave her house. Went around expecting to hear despair and unhappiness and complaint. But in the end, it was, I wouldn't have wished this upon myself. I don't wish it upon anyone else. But the depth of my relationship with God as I'm spending this time in prayer has been a real blessing. I'm sure you have stories like this about how you don't just have to wait for the total victory of God over your suffering and pain at the end, but you see glimpses of it here and now as he works it for good, as he brings a purpose out of that which has no purpose. And maybe you're stuck in that grief spiral at the moment, and God's tapping you on the shoulder. Maybe he's saying, now's the time to stop looking about how to make things better, to stop looking about how to change your circumstances as bad as they are, and to start to see how he is at work in you and through you in the midst of them. I've really loved our journey through the book of Job. One of the things I've appreciated is the breadth when it comes to dealing with suffering. We all kind of fall into one of two camps, don't we? We're either the bubbly optimists or the the grumpy pessimists. And there's part of that, of how to suffer that we would relate to more easily out of Job in each of those. If we're the bubbly optimists, we might see Job worshipping God at the beginning. We might see him hoping, looking for purpose. We might see him being humble in learning from God in the midst of it and go, absolutely, that's what it's all about. If you can just have a good attitude, you can get through your suffering. And if we're that kind of pessimist, that kind of more grumbly thing, we might look at Job mourning and grieving, cutting his hair, pouring out his anguish, his heartfelt, brutally honest prayer to God, accusing God basically of doing the wrong thing, of accusing God of cheating, of hiding. And we might look at that and think, yeah, that's what we do in the midst of suffering. We moan, we groan, we don't just fly over it, we go in the midst of it. What this book is telling us is that we need both. You need to acknowledge your loss when it comes. You need people around you that can help you grieve. You need to be brutally honest with God. But we also need to persevere in worship and in hope and in finding that purpose. I want to leave you with this. I'll leave you with an invitation for the rest of today and for the rest of this week to think through what God is calling you to in the midst of that. Maybe he's calling you to step into, to acknowledge some losses that you've experienced that you've been pushing down under the surface. Or maybe he's calling you to get out of the spiral, start to see where there is some purpose coming out of where there was no purpose in the first place.